The myth of the vampire has been around for a very long time, at least before medieval era. It started when people started to get sick. Usually what would happen is one member of the family would pass away from some mysterious illness, they would bury that person, and then about 2 weeks later their entire family would suddenly fall mysteriously ill. What's more, many illnesses caused pox, or open sores often on the neck. A popular theory at the time was that people were getting sick not from diseases but from demon possession, and that they would rise from the grave at night to haunt and sicken their families. The myth of the vampire really took off when a couple of men were brave enough to go and dig out the body of someone thought to haunt the town. What they found was, of course, a bloated corpse, which often happens when bacteria creates gases in the body, and these gases also push blood up through the lungs and out the mouth and the nose. So in other words, they saw this huge leech-like creature that seemingly was oozing blood out of its mouth. When they decided to finally kill this undead creature, they did so by staking its heart and puncturing its neck. And they found that tons of blood gushed out. So they believed that this undead creature was not only crawling out of its grave and infecting its family and other townsfolk, they thought it was doing so by engorging on their blood. This myth was also helped by the fact that when someone is decaying, their skin tends to tighten and recede. And the receding gums causes the teeth to look more fang-like. And the receding skin on the hands causes the fingernails to look more claw-like. So if you look at a corpse, especially a couple weeks into decomposition, it often looks very ghoulish, with fangs and claws, blood coming out of its orifices, bloated on blood, almost like a leech. And this started the whole theory that demons can infest the body, cause someone to die and then become undead, and then haunting people at night. This theory was further validated once they started to dig up corpses regularly, often to burn them, put bricks in their mouth, or otherwise make sure that they couldn't rise up and wreak havoc. And sometimes, just once in a while, they found claw marks on the insides of coffin lids. This is because, back before the 1800s, people would often die, seemingly, of things like hypothermia or asphyxiation, but what would really happen is their heart would just slow way down, their blood pressure would drop, their skin would grow ashen, and then they would be buried alive. Now, once they're in the ground, they might warm up, they might come to, and suddenly they find that there's no way out. And fears of being buried alive really took off, especially in the medieval era up through the 1800s. In fact, if you paid a little extra to the mortuary, they would build in a little string inside your coffin that would go up to a bell above the ground, so that if you happened to be buried alive, you could ring the bell and hopefully the gravemaster would come and dig you out. Now, on record, there's no one that's been saved by this bell, but that's where the term "saved by the bell" comes from. And in fact, there are even stories of hands and appendages reaching out of the grave. Of course, back in the day, people weren't buried that deeply, and often they were buried in very weak coffins. If it was good wood, they wouldn't waste it on coffins. So if people were buried alive, there was a good chance they might be able to break out of their coffin and partially dig out, but they would probably suffocate in the process. This whole idea of the undead permeated into many forms, the vampire being one of them, but also inspiring myths about werewolves and zombies. The werewolf is an especially interesting myth because it started with a distinctly real event, the infestation of wolf with rabies in a small French town. In one night in this town, over 60 people were attacked by rabid wolves. And then, of course, many of them contracting rabies, a few days later they would start to take on these wolf qualities of their own. Many of them would, of course, foam at the mouth due to excess salivation, but they would also exhibit rabid behaviors such as super aggression and the desire to gnash one's teeth and bite at people. So in this way, it's not so far-fetched to think that these people were becoming like wolves. The whole idea that people turn into wolves on the full moon is sort of a mixture of theories that come along with this whole idea that the full moon causes people to do crazy things. And in fact, there's even some psychological research to back this up. It's probably just due to the fact that a full moon causes it to be pretty light outside at night, and that causes more people to be out at night, perhaps doing not such good things. But this is where we get the term lunatic. In other words, becoming crazy with the moon or the lunar cycle. The vampire and the werewolf myths often interbred with each other. Vampires are often associated with wolves and dogs, as well as bats, which happen to be the animals that most likely carry and pass along rabies to humans. One particularly interesting symptom of rabies is the phobia of water, known as hydrophobia. This happens because rabid people and animals are so dehydrated that they desperately want to drink water, but their throat is so sore that to swallow would cause extreme pain. So the sight of water often causes repulsion, turning away, slapping away water if it's offered, and sometimes even running away if someone offers water. This may actually be the impetus for the whole idea behind holy water. Oftentimes when people were rabid, they thought that they were possessed, and thus they would use holy water to try to cure them. Now seemingly the demon inside them would be repulsed by the water, thus it must be working. But in fact it was just the person being hydrophobic. Another myth that spawned out of rabies is the idea that garlic can protect you. And in fact it can protect you against someone with rabies. This is because someone with rabies is so sensitive to strong smells that if they smell something like garlic, they'll often turn and run in the opposite direction. And so in medieval Europe, when there was all these rabies epidemics, people would often wear cloves of garlic around their necks. One of the more interesting aspects of zombies and undead in general is that there might even be a bit of truth to it. In fact, in Haiti in the 1960s, there was actually an epidemic of zombies. Now these of course weren't actual people who were undead, but there was a really interesting case that spread around the world that made it seem that way. In the 1960s, a man seemingly died in his sleep, not too uncommon of a situation. His sister brought him to the hospital, identified the body, and they ended up burying it with her consent. Several years later, this woman was walking around the streets of Haiti and happened to see her brother just walking around. Amazingly, he recognized her, ran up to her, and he had this amazing story that he had been actually dead but risen up by this voodoo master who made him work as a slave on his plantation. This voodoo master supposedly died, and that's why he got released and found his sister sometime later. Now this made national headlines at the time, and the Scotland Yard even got involved. They picked out his death certificate and matched the thumbprint on it from the supposed corpse of her brother and matched it to this new man who'd been found on the streets of Haiti. And this guy knew all the memories of what his brother should remember, and when they digged up his coffin was empty. So rather than this being explained through magic or supernatural causes, it turns out this comes down to body and brain chemistry. The supposed voodoo masters of the 1950s and 60s were really infecting people with neurotoxins, often from things like pufferfish and noxious toads. These voodoo masters would first concoct a potion that would make it seem as if someone was dead. The scary thing about these toxins is you could be infected just through contact. So usually they would do something like coat someone's doorknob. So someone would come home, touch the doorknob on their way in, and then fall asleep a few minutes later. Now once a relative found them, their heartbeat would have been slowed down so much so that they would seem dead. Then it was the hope that they would be buried so that the voodoo master or someone who worked for them could then dig them up and then have this person as a slave. So once they had this supposedly undead person, they would continue to make them ingest toxins that would make them very pliable to suggestion, these toxins often shutting down the frontal cortex, making it so that you can't inhibit your own behavior and thus you're very suggestible. In other words, make them work for free without really any volition of their own. When these people were sometimes encountered at plantations, they were so drugged that they couldn't even speak. Thus, when you asked them a question, they would simply growl, mutter, or groan. Again, much like the current zombie myth. Now, this whole idea of zombies working on plantations in Haiti, of course, morphed itself over the years and eventually became the topic of blockbuster movies like Dawn of the Dead. And that's really where we get our current zombie myth today. The whole idea that zombies eat brains actually came from a parody remake of Dawn of the Dead, not a well-known film, but one where the idea of brains eating really took off. So where will the myths of tomorrow come from? Probably again from kernels of truth originating in real-life horrors. Now our society most fears things like diseases from nuclear radiation and pandemics such as Ebola, and so it's no surprise that we're particularly interested in things like infestations. This is probably what's causing the current fervor over zombies. But whatever the myths of tomorrow are, no doubt that people thousands of years from now will be gathered around campfires and talking about their favorite scary monsters. There's something in us that loves to be scared. Perhaps it's just a morbid curiosity or evolutionary pressure to always fear the unknown, but for whatever the reason, we should take a little time every once in a while to just enjoy our monsters. If you're interested in this topic, check out this awesome book by Matt Kaplan, Medusa's Gaze and Vampire's Bite. It gets into the science of a bunch of monsters, including ones we didn't have time to talk about here.